Okay, good morning. Welcome everyone to this lunch briefing. I'm Joëlle Noyer, Head of Research of the Center for International Environmental Studies here at the Graduate Institute. Our research center conducts academic work and organizes this type of policy event to transfer knowledge and to debate on global environmental issues. So it's with special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome Professor Tim Flannery for this lunch briefing today. Tim Flannery is one of the most prominent environmentalists, and he's also the Fondation Segré Distinguished Visiting Professor here at the Graduate Institute. He's been a regular guest of our research center over the last years, and our students and faculty have very much enjoyed interacting with him and benefiting from his valuable insights. So thank you, Tim, for being here again today. Tim Flannery is also professor at the Melbourne University Sustainability Institute. He has taught at Harvard University and has advised the government of Australia and Canada on climate policy. He has published more than 140 peer-reviewed articles, published numerous books on climate change. Alone, I can only highly recommend two of his books, The Atmosphere of Hopes and The Weather Makers, which has been translated in more than 20 languages. Tim Flannery has also served on the board and advised numerous organizations such as the WWF International, Prince of Monaco Foundation, and the National Geographic Society. And what's also valuable to know is that beside his expertise on climate change issues, he's also an explorer and biologist, specialist of the New Guinea and surrounding countries, and he has named many living and fossil mammal species. Today, lunch briefing is going to be on the climate crisis. This is a very timely event, as you may be aware of that as we speak, 196 countries are meeting in Madrid for the COP25. So given the contribution of the different countries, what is now on the table is that we're heading for a trajectory of 3.2 global warming by the end of the century. So let's stay tuned and see what comes out of Madrid on Friday. What Tim Flannery will tell us today is that we're indeed entering in a new decade of where we will see the consequences of our inaction on climate change. So what can we do about it? What is the type of disruptive change that we need to implement for this challenge? So on those questions, and without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Tim Flannery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joëlle, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here today. I won't be using a PowerPoint for this presentation because I feel it distances us a bit from the reality of the situation we're in. I met James Lovelock, the originator of the Gaia hypothesis, on his 100th birthday earlier this year. And he told me that he just attended a briefing on climate change at the Tyndall Centre, one of the world's leading scientific research organisations looking at climate. And he saw many graphs and graphics and talked to scientists about the trends. And he said he came away feeling as if he were examining the climate crisis on a different planet, that somehow we can talk to the graphs objectively. It's not us that are actually going to be subject to these changes. So graphs are informative, but they can distance us from the fate of this Earth, I think. And the truth is that the time to act on climate change is now terrifyingly short. When I was appointed Australia's Climate Commissioner in 2011, the very first report that we produced was a report titled The Critical Decade. And the reason we did that was it was very clear even back then that the decade 2010 to 2020 was going to be absolutely critical in terms of our response and how successful we would be in limiting damage from climate change. But here we are in 2019, towards the end of 2019. Technically, the decade will run for another 12 months till the end of 2020. But with just a year remaining, it's really glaringly clear that we have failed to act. No meeting that we've held, no scientific report or political agreement over the past 30 years has altered the upwards trajectory of emissions growth. We've just continued to pollute more and more and more, despite every warning, every agreement, everything else that we have done over that decade. In fact, half of all greenhouse gases that we've ever emitted as a species have been emitted over the last 30 years. So we have, I have to say it, even the best efforts of all of us have failed to alter the trajectory. We've failed to secure our children's future in a way we would have liked to have done. Even last year, greenhouse gas emissions continued to rise. The burning of fossil fuels increased by, or CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels increased by 1.7% last year over the year before, and concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere rose by a record-breaking 3.5 parts per million. So it's, as long as we've been keeping records, the last 60 or 70 years, that's the biggest increase ever. And while the figures for this year are yet to come in, it seems pretty clear that this year will see another increase in emissions. Countries like China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, project that they'll continue increasing emissions, or at least most likely increasing emissions out to 2030. Annual emissions now stand at more than 53 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, as it's called, per annum. And I just want to think about how big that pollution stream is, because it gives us a sense of the challenge we face. So we can do it two ways, really. One is we can ask ourselves, how many people would we need to vaporise and put into the atmosphere in order to make up that 53 gigatons? We probably weigh on average 35 kilograms, from little to big. There's about 7.6 billion of us. You can do the maths, but basically we've got to vaporise us all twice over, the entire Earth's population twice over, to make up 1 year's worth of emissions of greenhouse gases from humanity. Another way of thinking about it is just framing the question saying, what would we need to do to draw out of the atmosphere just 10% of that pollution stream? So say around about 5 gigatons. The answer to that question is that we would need to cover the entire contiguous 48 states of the USA in rapidly growing forest and keep that forest growing for a century, so that on average over that time period we would draw down about 5 gigatons per annum, around about. And of course we can't do that. The United States, lower 48, much of it is committed to other purposes than growing forest. A lot of it won't even support forest. But it gives you a sense of the scale of the pollution stream that we're currently putting into the atmosphere. The ultimate result is that CO2 concentrations are now at a level that was last observed in Earth's history around about 4 million years ago. So we are facing serious disruption. And the politicians recognise this. Just a few days ago at the opening of the Madrid climate meeting, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres underlined the meeting's urgency. He said that the climate crisis could soon reach the point of no return. So that means that no matter what we do after that point, we're not going to change our fate. He added that while what is still lacking is political will, and that the world's largest emitters are not pulling their weight. Now, I come from a country that falls into that category. Australia is the second largest exporter of coal on the planet and one of the largest exporters of natural gas, and our government consistently wins the dinosaur award at the climate meetings. I can't tell you how frustrating that is, coming from a city that's now besieged by the most intense bushfires it's ever seen in its history, which are triggered by climate change, by drying, a warming, an intensity of wind speeds that are making fire something that we haven't seen in the past. Globally, what's at stake was clearly laid out last Thursday in the world's leading journal, Nature. Exeter University's Professor Tim Flannery and his colleagues said that Earth was approaching a number of key tipping points, and this is what Guterres was talking about, these key tipping points or events that could plunge us into irreversible climate change. And many, they suggested, were much closer than was previously assumed. Among the most important of those tipping points involve melting ice. One tipping point, which involves the triggering of destabilisation in the Amundsen ice sheet in West Antarctica, has, the paper argued, already been passed. So it's too late to save the Amundsen ice sheet. The result will be sea level rise of about 3 metres, just from the decay of that ice sheet and the melting of that ice sheet. But they also noticed that we're rapidly approaching, if we haven't already crossed, the point of destabilisation for the Wilkes Basin ice sheet in East Antarctica. That will commit us to a further 3 to 4 metres of sea level rise. And on current trends, the Greenland ice sheet could destabilise by 2030, adding a further 7 metres of sea level rise. So that's committing us to 14 metres, roundabout, of sea level rise. That is catastrophic disruption. The time that it takes to melt all that ice is, of course, the key factor. And if we can keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, it could take as long as 10,000 years to melt that ice, which would be a great thing for humanity. If we allow temperatures to rise beyond 2 degrees, however, above the pre-industrial average, that melting could take 1,000 years or less. So the pace of change is very much in our hands. Biosphere tipping points also loom, the paper argued. The global deaths of Earth's coral reefs is one of the most poignant for me. I remember diving on the Great Barrier Reef in 1973 before coral bleaching was ever heard of. Today, 80% of that reef is dead. It's tragic going back and seeing the damage. It's been killed by coral bleaching caused by warming as well as other factors. And when I dive on the reef, I think about taking my children to dive on the reef. I'm just filled with an immense sense of dread. Something that I enjoyed in my lifetime will never be available to younger people on this planet. Why? Simply because we want to keep burning fossil fuels. It seems like such an unnecessary and terrible tragedy that if I could just gather all of the members of that are in Madrid, all of the leaders, political leaders from around the world, I'd just like to ask them, do you really want your children to grow up in a world without coral reefs? Because that is what you're committing to, unless you resolve to take much deeper action than what you're taking today. That scientific report also makes clear that the loss of the Amazonian rainforests and the melting of permafrost, two key tipping points, are already occurring. They're proceeding right now. How far they go is a matter for us. In the Arctic this last summer, some really ominous data were collected. Atmospheric concentrations of methane that exceeded 2,050 parts per billion were recorded at almost 10 locations. That's just unprecedented. There's a lot of methane coming out of the permafrost as it melts. I had friends who were working up there. They said this year, they've been going up for many years, but this year the permafrost, the vegetation on the permafrost was crisp. It had dried out so much in the heat. It was crisp on top, and the shores were littered with thousands and thousands of migratory shorebirds that couldn't find enough food through in the warming seas. This year, those shorebirds, they arrive in Australia in the southern hemisphere. I've got friends who are observing them then, who are seeing again hundreds and hundreds of starving shorebirds wash up, and very, very low numbers coming back to the traditional breeding grounds, perhaps half of what they typically see. Russian researchers also documented methane flares erupting from the permafrost underlying shallow Arctic seas. It's pretty clear that if nothing's done, the destabilisation of the Arctic will accelerate, it'll alter our oceans, cause cascades of extinctions, and send unimaginable volumes of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. The very sober scientific paper that was published in Nature ended with a plea, which is very unusual for a scientific paper. The plea was just 2 words: act now. That's how it ended. It's hard, as a scientist, to see those words and see we have to transcend the science even somehow to be heard. So why aren't we acting right now? It's pretty clear that some individuals see that it's in their best interest not to act. So the CEOs of Australia's coal companies, the fracking companies in Texas and those building new coal-fired power plants in China will all grow wealthy at the same time that they destroy our world. I would argue that it's not in their best interest to do that. No one can thrive in isolation, and the sort of devastation that we are wreaking on the world now is so deep that everything from our biodiversity to our food security to our coastal cities is under threat. It's not something you can isolate yourself from. And besides, it's an intergenerational problem. Those people need to ask themselves if their children will ever forgive them for doing what they are currently doing. Now, when I look at these meetings that we're holding now, including the one in Madrid, it seems to me that the actions coming out of them are totally anemic and inadequate. It's true that we've seen disinvestment start to bite, and some of the fossil fuel companies start to be starved of investment funds. But government regulation remains pathetic relative to the scale of the problem, and trade deals continue to ignore carbon. You know, I remember a decade ago when Bush was in the White House and people were talking about addressing climate change. Some of the Republicans at that point were saying, we need carbon tariffs. We need tariffs so that if we do something, we can be sure that others will follow. Those sort of utterances, those sort of threats, I suppose they were at the time, are no longer being heard. People seem content just to muddle through. So where is global leadership on the climate issue? I don't know, it's a great question, but young people ask it with increasing urgency. For them, their whole lives are in front of them, and they see the lack of action as a betrayal of their futures. They know when we talk about 2050, 2070, or even 2100, many of them will still be alive. In fact, by 2050, the students I teach here at the Institute will be younger than I am. So I look out to that world and the projections that we face by mid-century without action, and I'm horrified. We've already seen widespread school strikes and the beginnings even of rebellion in form of Extinction Rebellion. As young people realise how selfish the few have been in stealing the future of all, I really fear that their anger will become white hot. It won't just be marching in the streets, it'll be something else. With all warnings ignored for over 30 years and with consequences such as the Australian and Californian bushfires now manifesting, no one involved in impeding action to address climate change is acting in innocence. All of them are acting in a way that can perhaps best be characterised as malice aforethought. They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing now, and yet they continue to do it. Perhaps some will act. Some will suggest that they've been acting with criminal intent, and the politicians who aid and abet them are likely to be held equally culpable by future generations. Yet we still live in a moment where it's possible for all of us to act to avert total catastrophe, as the research paper published last Thursday suggested. In my view, we need a threefold approach if we are going to deal adequately with this problem. The first and most important step is to sharply reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. We've all committed to do this under the Paris Agreement. We've all pledged to act, and yet some are not honouring their pledges. In my view, that has to elicit real economic consequences from the nations that are acting. Otherwise, the Paris Agreement adds up to nothing. Second, we need to get some of the gas out of the air that we've already emitted. We are past the point now, sadly, where we can solve this problem simply by cutting emissions. You know, the last time that we could do that in a realistic way, I felt, was back in 2009 at the Copenhagen Summit. I was chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council at the time, and the failure of that meeting to produce anything beyond the Copenhagen Accord, that one-page document forged by Barack Obama, was heartbreaking, because I knew after that we were going to have to rely on totally unproven technologies as well to try to draw some gas out of the air. We simply couldn't balance the books just by cutting emissions. So we need to invest in drawdown technologies. They're technologies that range from land management practices through to very high-tech things like direct air capture of CO2 that will allow us in future to draw down carbon or CO2 at scale. The great thing about drawdown is that it doesn't depend entirely upon political agreement. Drawdown technologies offer the opportunity to develop an entirely new, clean economy. Many opportunities are investable right now, and we can start first competing with fossil fuels and replacing them, and then moving on deeper into the drawdown equation where we sequester some carbon in the biosphere and then ultimately, more permanently, in the rocks and oceans. That new economy is going to be one in which transport fuels, carbon fibres and plastics are all going to be made from CO2, where cities will be built with carbon negative materials and so become carbon sinks rather than carbon sources, and where food can be sustainably and securely grown without emissions. As I said, this drawdown approach really has three elements to it. The first one is substituting fossil fuels with materials drawn from the atmosphere, with CO2 drawn from the atmosphere. This is already happening. There's a company called Geoengineering that manufactures substitute jet fuels made directly from atmospheric CO2. It's 25% more expensive than conventional jet fuels today. But can you imagine what it would mean if a commitment was made by the international air industry, aviation industry, to shift to cleaner fuels? That price would come down. And even at its worst, today if we add 25% increase to jet fuel costs, my guess is that a flight from here to London, if it cost you €100 today, might cost you 105, 110. I don't know what the equivalent is, but it's not going to break the bank, even to move to cleaner fuels straight away. Beyond that is the short-term storage of carbon in the biosphere. These approaches, such as growing trees, such as using biochar in our soils or shifting to more sustainable forms of agriculture, have benefits. There's obviously a small cost involved, or at least some benefit foregone, because you could, instead of growing a forest, be growing a crop. But nevertheless, the costs are very small, and the additional or side benefits of moving to a less carbon intense or to storing carbon in the biosphere are very, very great. They protect our biodiversity, they protect our water supplies at a time when they're under threat from climate change, and they allow for more sustainable food production. So again, I think that they're bankable. They're things we should be doing now, straight away. We shouldn't be waiting for government before we act in those areas. The longer-term storage of carbon at scale in rocks and in the oceans probably needs some government support, because what we're doing there is we are growing usually a crop, typically seaweed, which I'll come to in a minute, and throwing it away. That needs a cost. We can use silicate rocks also to capture CO2 out of the atmosphere and do it at a cost. I should just point out that I had 18 students this year. I had 18 fabulous essays in my course. One of the students wrote an essay on the use of silicate rocks to capture carbon, and through a great piece of research revealed that we could be doing this at the cost of €10 a tonne, really at real scale, using these rocks to sequester carbon by the gigatonne. So I think we can see here that there's potential if we can move. With government, we do it much faster, but without government, we would still be making progress. Seaweed is one of those opportunities that I talk about a lot just because it seems so scalable and so close. Seaweed grows a lot faster than most trees. It can grow 60 centimetres a day, and it captures a lot of carbon during its lifetime. Typically, a third of the dry weight of seaweed is carbon. So it's growing 60 centimetres a day. It's pulling lots and lots of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Moreover, because the land surface is so heavily committed to various uses, there's a limit to what we can do on land, but in the oceans we have a much larger space. 71% of the Earth's surface is oceans, and it's far less utilised. Seaweed farming is already a $6 billion a year industry. We know how to grow seaweed at scale already and at profit, and already experiments are underway to expand that industry quite dramatically into new areas such as offshore, where it doesn't currently exist. The supply of nutrients to seaweeds is a big barrier. Mid-ocean areas are basically a desert. There's no seaweed growing in them today. But nutrients and cold water are available 400 metres below those mid-ocean deserts, and they can result in the growth of seaweed at scale. And we can pump up those nutrients using clean energy. And this is an area where government can really help. Incentivising the uptake of these sort of new industries in a way that both feed the planet and that draw down carbon is something so desirable. I can't understand why we are bogged down with minutiae in these negotiations instead of setting aside a separate stream for drawdown, saying let's absolutely hammer emissions, but let's set aside some time for making sure we can get some of the CO2 out of the air, because there is now no choice. Seaweed growing has a lot of multiple benefits. It reduces the acidity of the oceans, and seaweed farms are ideal places to grow fish and shellfish in what's known as ocean permaculture. Really, seaweed farming at that scale is a multi-potent technology. It'll help us feed the world, clean our oceans, and draw down CO2 out of the atmosphere at the scale required. The best news is that seaweed farms that grow in the deep ocean can also sequester carbon in that third way I mentioned, a way that is very long term. Any seaweed that reaches the ocean depths below a kilometre or so, the carbon in that seaweed remains out of circulation for centuries, if not millennia. It's a long-term carbon store, much better than a lot of the land-based stores where trees can be attacked by bugs or burnt, or somehow or other the CO2 released from them. Because the oceans are 500 times larger than the atmosphere, they can also absorb a lot of carbon before they start getting damaged. The amount of CO2 you'd need to double concentrations in the atmosphere above the pre-industrial level, sink that into the oceans, and you would only be adding 2% of the CO2 concentration in the deep ocean. So you're taking pollution from a very small bucket and putting it into a very, very large bucket. There's, of course, a lot we don't know about all of these drawdown technologies, and there are plenty of dangers to contemplate. But this is the time to start trying to understand what the adverse consequences might be of acting at scale, and how we might best start drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. If we don't do that, if we don't take those risks, we'll face much greater risks as our climate situation deteriorates. The third pillar that I want to discuss today, in addition to drawdown and cutting emissions, is geoengineering. Until recently, I've been so reluctant to consider geoengineering as a solution because it looked to me like a band-aid hiding a festering sore that wasn't addressing the key issue of CO2. But I think we've now got to such a point, particularly when we look at our poles, where the tipping points involving ice are so imminent that we need to consider measures to protect the cryosphere. The most advanced of the geoengineering options available to us to do that involve putting sulphur in jet fuel for flights that pass over the Arctic and Antarctic. This potentially could preserve the poles and help conserve the ice that is up there. It's a cheap, immediately effective and very short-lived solution, so you need to keep on adding sulphur to the stratosphere if you want to keep it cool. But if you stop doing it, then the effect goes away very quickly. There's so many questions around geoengineering. How effective is it going to be? What will the impact be on global circulation? What will the impact be on local acidification at the poles? We don't have answers to these questions at the moment. All of the modelling we have looking at geoengineering involves sulphur sources from volcanoes, not from jet aircraft. So there's a huge research effort needed here. But my feeling is that 5 years from now, this is going to become quite an urgent issue. We need to start doing the due diligence now. Implementing the tripartite plan to stabilise the climate that I've just outlined should be the subject of urgent discussion by our global leaders. Instead, what I see is a kind of a grossly dysfunctional world. You know, we mob a teenager like Greta Thunberg as if she's a modern-day Joan of Arc, expecting her to solve the problems. The truth is we're the ones that have to solve the problems. It is this generation of leaders right now that have to act to solve the problems. And there'll be no excuses, and I fear very little forgiveness from the Thunbergs of the world if we should fail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this talk. I think what's very important is your key message also on the role of drawdown technologies. I find that very important to note now, that we need to act now. I'll use this opportunity to ask the first question before we move to the audience. So I was wondering if you would have any example of specific policies that would push this type of drawdown technologies. So you mentioned that we need to do it even without government intervention, but of course we could go much faster if there would be specific policies put in place. Do you know about any specific example?
Indeed there are, and I wrote a policy paper, policy briefing for the department on this. One of the most surprising new policies has come out of the first Trump budget. So the February 2018 US budget included a clause which offered what is effectively a shadow price for carbon. It offered a $50 a tonne tax credit for companies that were engaging in geological sequestration of carbon, and a $35 tax credit, US tax credit, for companies involved in the productive use of CO2, atmospheric CO2. There are a few clauses that make it difficult for small companies to access. One is that you have to be drawing down or utilising 100,000 tonnes a year to be to have that tax credit applied to you. But one of the good things about it is that it's not the government that will decide the definition of geological sequestration or of productive use, but it's the agencies. And in the US, the way that these agencies work is that a case is put before them by an industry typically, and the agency then makes a decision on that. So it could be that sinking seaweed into the ocean deep is considered by the agencies geological sequestration. Yeah. It may be that some other technology, such as using biochar, is considered productive use. We'll have to see how that works out. But there is a real role, I think, for other governments like the EU to use that particular piece of legislation as a template to develop more climate-friendly approaches that really encourage small-scale experimentation that allow us to get a much clearer fix on what the best and most cost-effective drawdown options are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll take some questions from the audience. I'll ask you to please introduce yourself and to make sure you have a specific question in mind rather than a general comment. Maybe we start here first. Yeah, the microphone is coming.
Good day. My name is Lisa Kishilov. I study not here but around, and I studied sustainable management in my bachelor's. And right now I'm studying international relations, so that's like kind of this combination of the crisis and how do we govern it. And first, thank you for being here. And second, the idea of global governance, I think this is one of the most dramatic issues because international organizations kind of fail to do so. With superpowers, it seems there's no proper action coming from that side. Do you have any idea, would there be an external institution that should be created? Should it be coming more from civil society? Is it a multiplayer zone? Do you have some type of personal idea? Because you said there is no, you didn't.
Yeah. I mean, that's the great question facing us in the absence of global government. How do we act? And what I see is, at least in the financial sector, that there are certain companies now, businesses, that won't fund fossil fuel development. And that, I guess that in the private sector is one example of a group of people just saying, no, we're not doing that. A bit like we have with tobacco and that sort of thing. In the government area, as much as I hate the idea of trade barriers and tariff barriers, they're being imposed now by the US on China and other places, but we're not talking about carbon tariffs anymore. We were a decade ago, so I wonder why not. And maybe we need to sort of define some real clear criteria around that, so at least we can argue that in future, if goals haven't been met, there will be some consequences. I don't know how else to create those consequences beyond using trade.
Thank you. We'll take the gentleman and then...
Given what you've been saying also about the intransigence of certain governments, which is the US, Australia, and sadly, I suspect the UK next week, what are your thoughts about other modes of input into governmental bodies or societal bodies? One of the things you did, I was thinking of your Australia Climate Council. It seems to have been very effective in working with municipalities to do something. Is this one of the sort of routes that we could be taking broadly around the world?
Yeah, look, I think it's true that lower levels of government are far more accountable than higher levels of government. And here in Switzerland, I think you've got a great example of that. The cantons are quite accountable to people. And that's why in Australia, the Climate Council started working with our local councils, our local governments, because they are really directly in touch with the population. If the garbage isn't taken off the streets, it's the council that gets the cops the trouble from that. And people in Australia, by and large, want more action on climate change. So we have found it very, very valuable to engage with councils, moderately valuable to do so with state governments. So typically in Australia, these are city-states, and there's some coherence in policy response as a result. But at the federal level, the highest level of government is captured by industry to such a large degree that it is really difficult to get any traction. So I think that model is a good one. Much more needs to be done though, Peter, I think. I mean, that's a start. But we somehow need to start getting more adventurous and braver people into politics. A few more younger people wouldn't hurt, And perhaps we're starting to see that in the US.
There was the gentleman in blue there.
Thank you very much, Tim. My name is Devendra Rana. I'm a consultant on this issue. The question I have is, you talked about governance issues. You talked about drawdown technologies, etc. You also obviously, we're talking about carbon and taking things out of the atmosphere. So the question I'd like to put to you is, what do you think about carbon pricing? I mean, I've heard of Article 6, that's the discussion that's happening at this moment. And what I've also heard is that that's a sort of a make or break. It could be bad if it's too loose, but if it's too tight, it could, it could be of help to future generations in terms of actually emissions reduction, but also in terms of capture and storage.
Yeah. No, look, you're absolutely right about carbon pricing being central. I should have spoken about it. I find it difficult. I was Climate Commissioner in Australia when climate pricing was introduced, and the backlash caused by the far right in Australia in terms of telling outright lies about the impact of the carbon pricing was such that that carbon pricing was discontinued. I was sacked. We had a wholesale change. And I think we're still the only country on the planet to have introduced a carbon price and then withdrawn it. So we've seen how catastrophic the results can be if done wrongly or done insensitively. I do think we need carbon pricing. when I look at the slowness of the implementation, though, it is concerning. We've got a very urgent issue. Now, carbon pricing would be wonderful to have, but I think we need a lot of things at the same time.
Yes, good afternoon. Derek Kwasi from the Geoengineering Incubator, where we look at technologies and new types of financial innovation to address negative externalities. First of all, thank you very much. My question is about actually the last 20 years and digitalization of economies. Is this maybe an opportunity to provide some traceability, transparency, and maybe lead to, for example, what some actors are calling natural capital, try to define what capital is, going beyond financial capital to natural capital? And linked to that, do you see some new types of technologies, mostly in the monetary system, that could go beyond pricing to maybe shape the way we allocate resources? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, that's another very, very profound question. And I'm probably not the most qualified person to answer it. But it does seem to me that younger people are questioning the bases of the current system and the way that we do our accounts and the way we deal with money. They want something more. They want a better quality of life and a bit more sustainable outcome than what we get given the current system. I hope that there are some entrepreneurs out there who are working on that and trying to bring some reality to it. As I said, I'm just not an expert in that area. So I think it obviously is the basic problem, isn't it? The way we do our accounts, we can drive species to extinction and make a profit from it. We can undermine the basis of our existence and make a profit from it. We need to somehow change that.
And I think your neighbor also had a question, yeah.
Yes, hello. My name is André Lang. I'm a French-German lawyer, basically involved in renewable energy projects. What do you think, shouldn't we consider CO2 more and more as a commodity that we can trade? So if you bring in CO2, a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, well, you have to pay. If you get it out, you get some price for it. So I think we need, it sounds a little bit bizarre, but we need a little bit more capitalistic action in that field to make it profitable to do good things for the atmosphere. And then I got a second question concerning, I don't know if you know Tom Grather lab from ETH in Zurich. They made a fantastic analysis how to remove CO2 from the atmosphere while planting trees.
Yes.
There's one of his students, he created something like 10 to 15 years ago, organization Plant for the Planet, a kids organization, more than 60,000 kids are already involved in to plant trees, because I think that is as well quite a good action to do something. Thank you.
Yeah, look, thank you. Can I take the planting trees bit first? Look, it's great to plant trees. It's very important in terms of biodiversity, in terms of protecting our water sources, as I said, in terms of cooling the planet at one level as well through transpiration, yeah? But there's just not enough available land on the surface of the planet to solve or even go part of the way, a significant part of the way, by just planting trees. Like I said, we'd need to cover the contiguous lower 48 states of the USA to just draw down 10% of the current pollution stream. So trees are going to be valuable, but they won't be a significant part, I think, of the response. Soil carbon's a little bit better. Soil carbon stores are about twice the size of the biological carbon stores, so they'll help a bit. But I really think that we need to turn to the oceans for scalable solutions. Or maybe to silicate rocks. There's a few elements a few options out there, but they're frighteningly few. You know, I looked at 10,000 entries into the Virgin Earth Challenge, which was Richard Branson's £25 million prize for a technology that can draw a gigaton of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Out of those, there was less than the fingers on my hand that looked to be scalable. So there's not a lot of options as it currently exists. But the first part of your question about whether capitalism can help in terms of putting a price on carbon and a price on drawdown, I guess that's true, although it can't be a one-for-one price because the days of offsetting it are truly over. We now know we have to both cut pollution and draw CO2 out of the atmosphere at the same time. So I'll leave it to a better brain than me to work out what the pricing structure has to be, but clearly it has to be more than one-to-one. Why don't we take oh, sorry, you're doing it. Yeah.
We'll take all the way
I
in the
forgot
front.
I had a helper. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carly Schneider. I'm a climate advocate with the initiative here in Geneva, Real Food Systems. And my question has to do with your ideas about, or your projects with kelp, seaweed sequestration. My question is regarding what's your take on which has more potential? Natural expansion of existing kelp beds, for example, to higher latitudes when the water's warming, or what you're talking about with marine permaculture out in the open ocean, or maybe we need to do both.
Yeah, look, it's going to be a journey. I think that expanding marine aquaculture and particularly ocean permaculture in areas where there is a surfeit of nutrients running off the land, like the Yellow Sea in East Asia, that's really important because we can clean up waterways as well as at the same time we feed the planet. Increasing kelp beds, as you say, in areas where there's already kelp growing is also going to be an important way of doing it. So near-shore enhancement of kelp will be important. And we're already seeing some of that in Europe now with wind farms and so forth, looking at kelp production nearby. The big challenge, however, is going to be sequestering that carbon, because to sequester the carbon that's captured by kelp, you need to sink it 1 kilometre deep into the ocean. Some kelp naturally gets there through ocean currents and so forth, even the stuff that's grown near shore. But to do it at scale, we need to be working offshore, and the further you go offshore, the higher the cost, the more uncertainty, the more new technologies we need. And moreover, we need a carbon price, because you're effectively throwing away a crop, which closer to shore you may be selling for a profit. But I guess my argument is that that burden of CO2 above our heads, I'm just hoping enough people will see that as money in the bank. That it will drive ever more adverse consequences for all of us unless some of us can work out how to get some of it out of the air. And kelp farming is one of those options. And the day will come, I think, when we will be willing to pay for that service, just like we're willing to pay someone to take the garbage away from in front of our house today. Yeah? I don't know when that point will come, but when it does, then we can start looking at offshore ocean farming. Between now and then, we need to strengthen the existing industry, continue to experiment, and do what we can in terms of deacidifying the ocean and drawing CO2 out of the air through nearshore kelp farming, and of course feeding the planet at the same time.
Yeah, maybe we can collect the two questions in the middle of the two gentlemen here, in the front a bit. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Fred. I work on biodiversity law, international biodiversity law. The whole debate in the biodiversity community right now is how to generate transformational change in the way in which our societies operate, and this is obviously the same issue that we're facing in the climate situation. I don't know of any examples where humans have managed to do that in the past, and given the nature of the crisis at the moment, we have the extinction crisis and the climate crisis going on simultaneously, and one of them is getting much more attention, and obviously the concern is how do you actually have mutually beneficial solutions that lead to transformative change in both contexts, rather than a situation where you have climate action and then just some biodiversity safeguards to make sure that we avoid the worst consequences of planting the contiguous US with eucalyptus plantation or whatever it might be.
Exactly.
So I'd be interested in knowing more about these kind of joint solutions, like you're saying, planting or cultivating seaweed in areas where we have high nutrient runoff, for example, where we're trying to deal with multiple issues at the same time, and can hopefully do that for climate change and biodiversity.
Yeah, look, I agree wholeheartedly with you that the biodiversity loss is a very, very important and urgent issue that's being underfunded and sort of overwhelmed really by the discussion around climate response. If in a perfect world, I'd be seeing biodiversity loss in that adaptation area, with a lot of funding going to protecting biodiversity and helping it to adapt through what is going to be an inevitable period of climate change. I think there's also a really deep philosophical issue that's impeding us from action here. I mean, we are now, as far as the world goes, we're sort of like gods. You know, we can do almost anything. Our technology allows us to change the composition of the atmosphere, as we already are, in an undirected way. But I think we need to live up to that responsibility. We need to see that we are the ones, if anything's going to happen, we are going to have to do it. If species are going to be protected, if they're going to be brought back from the brink of extinction, we need to use the technologies and approaches we have available to us to do that. And there's still quite a reluctance on the part of some people, I think, just seeing there's nature over there and we're over here. And nature can, take care of itself if we only, stop doing certain things. Don't know whether that's true anymore. I think we actually have to live up to that responsibility. And again, I'd say just develop a plan, properly funded plan for protecting as much of the globe's biodiversity as we can.
Thank you, Professor. That was a really good lecture. I really appreciated it. I just want to kind of build on Fred's point and a word you were saying in there, and it's this conversation about adaptation and mitigation. And it's mostly the narratives that are linked to these two ideas. Mitigation is very linked to these moral ideas that you elevated as well, saying the youth will never forgive us and all these matters. But I'm thinking, shouldn't we have a bit of a change of narrative in the way we speak about things to engage with global leaders? They're clearly not engaging with the argument of morality, the argument that our children deserve a better future and whatnot. Shouldn't there be a conversation about adaptation and securing many of the world's population centers? Thank you very much.
Look, and I must say, I only had half an hour, so discussing adaptation wasn't, I just didn't have time to get to that point. I've tried for 30 years to talk to world leaders about climate change, and what I've seen is that self-interest always wins. So I don't know quite how we overcome that self-interest. It's a bit... can I just take a second to tell you, I've just finished reading a book called Against the Grain, which is a history of the earlier cities. And the man who wrote the book, Scott, his name is, I think, is he mentions this term politicide. And he said politicide happens when there's an outside stress, and such as a drought or whatever, and the leaders of these early cities refused to share the burden of dealing with that stress, so they pushed it all down onto those who were least able to resist. And of course the cities collapse because those people simply either revolt or die. And the modern world looks a bit like that to me. I think we have to find a way of dealing with that politicide issue.
Yes, Sam Carmel from the University of Geneva. All of your sequestration schemes, whatever they are going to require a fair amount of energy. But right now, we're still getting 80% of our energy from fossil fuels, which is creating the CO2 problem. Yeah. And I don't see how... I don't see where the energy comes from to do all of this and not just keep getting worse.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it's a good comment. And in terms of the use of silicate rocks, for example, we have to quarry them and grind them up at huge scale. Some studies, though, suggest that the cost of that is probably only 5% loss. You actually gain much more than you lose in that equation. That may be true. The other important thing to understand is that for the biological sequestration processes, like growing trees and growing seaweed or creating soil carbon, the energy source is free. It's the sun. Yeah, it's the chemical sources that require external energy. So making plastics from atmospheric CO2 or making jet fuel from atmospheric CO2. They're typically being done in areas today where there is a very cheap, clean energy source, such as Iceland, for example, which has lots of geothermal, or British Columbia, where there's lots of cheap old hydro resources. I think the equation's going to change in future, though. If you look at a place like Australia now, where the government is framing things and people are framing the argument, say we've got to replace our fossil fuel sources with clean energy sources. Some people, however, are saying, well, why stop there? Why not go up to 700% 5% of the current energy source. After all, solar is so cheap in our country, we can just keep on deploying it. And we've got a large area of land, magnificent solar resource. We should be doing minerals processing here in Australia using clean energy. So those sort of arguments, people are talking about doing this like in the fairly near future, that might change the equation. But I agree with you at the moment that for some of the drawdown options, the necessity to use fossil fuels is sort of a deal breaker, or at least compromises them.
Okay, we'll just have time for 2 last questions.
Tim, thank you. You mentioned, let me phrase it differently. I've been wondering why all this discussion seems to be siloed into the scientific approach regarding climate change and not a broader one. You mentioned before that half of all the emissions we have already done went up in the last 30 years. I don't think that's random. In the 80s, the global economic system changed dramatically. We moved into hyper-capitalism. Thatcher, Reagan, blah, blah, blah. And when you talk about politicians not hearing, really politicians are listening a lot, but on one side they have people like you and scientists saying we should do this, and on the other side they have economists saying actually we should do this. And I've been wondering whether there is any discussion between climate scientists and economists, because what we need to do is not only take down carbon or limit emissions, but we need to redesign the full global economic system, which is damn complex, is full of interconnections and interdependencies, and I think that's a real challenge.
Bruno, you're absolutely right. And one of the great joys of being here at the Graduate Institute is that I'm one of the only scientists in a group of economists and political scientists and others, and we do have some very fruitful discussions. I'd love to have many more of them. But I think that you're absolutely right. We need to somehow bridge that divide. The scientists are in their silo and the economists in theirs, and we don't meet often enough.
And just being an economist myself, I mean, there are a lot of debates, obviously, and a lot of dialogues between climate scientists and economists. And just what was discussed before on the accounting parts, on how do we measure economic growth, economic welfare. I mean, there are lots of discussion on that. So, yeah. There was one last question before we close.
Hello, my name is Clarice. I really wanted to thank you first for your lecture. And I was actually wondering, listening to you, whether we could say that leaders are actually right now wasting their time trying to reach an agreement instead of kind of thinking national and maybe even local to try and deal with the problem, because clearly it's going to be almost impossible to find an agreement that's going to please everyone. So maybe try to focus on lower scales to be able to actually do something that's going to make a difference.
Yeah, well, I guess we discussed this a little bit earlier with Peter's question about local councils and so forth. And that is true, that we do need to work at that level. But sadly, the national level often sets the agenda in terms of, say, carbon pricing or the rules around trade or whatever. And so we do need to get a breakthrough at that higher level as well, I think. And it's something we can't give up on. I just hope we get a younger and more energised leadership in some countries. And you see what it's done in New Zealand, for example. Jacinda Ardern, a woman in her 30s, Prime Minister, now have the most progressive climate policy, arguably, of any country on earth. So this can happen, but we need to make it happen.
So with this, I would like to close this event. Thank you a lot for joining us today and for your participation and your questions. If you want to know more about our events and our activities, I encourage you to subscribe to the environmental newsletter of the Graduate Institute or to follow the CIES Facebook page. And at last, we want to thank you, Tim, for being here today and joining us.